With the before and after pseudo elements, we can insert virtual elements before or after an element's content. These virtual elements are visible to the user and are also stylable with CSS, but they do not appear in the source code. So we can actually add to our HTML from our CSS. This is called generated content. Let's see how it works. To insert generated content into a page, we'll need to use the before and the after pseudo elements. They both work the same way, except that one inserts the content before the element and the other inserts the content after. So first, we'll go ahead and get started with the before pseudo element. Now, in order for these pseudo elements to work properly, we must use the content property. Otherwise, we won't be able to generate or insert any content. At the very least, the content property must contain an empty set of quotes as its value. So let's go ahead and insert a phone icon right before our phone number here, which, as we can see in the HTML file, is contained in a paragraph with the class phone. So in our style sheet, we'll go ahead and add the class phone right in front of the before pseudo element. Again, make sure that there is no space between the class and the pseudo element. We'll then use a common Unicode icon of a phone for the content value. So when we save our style sheet and click refresh in the browser, there we have our phone icon inserted right before the phone number text. Now, this phone icon we generated is now a pseudo element. It only exists because it was generated from our CSS. The after pseudo element works just like the before pseudo element, except that it inserts content after the selected element. So in our selector, we'll go ahead and replace the before pseudo element with after. When we save our style sheet and refresh the browser, now we see the icon generated after the text. We can also insert images using the content property. So for example, let's go ahead and insert a PDF icon right before this download link. Now you'll find the pdf.png image inside the img folder in our project directory. In our HTML file, notice how the download link is contained in an A tag with the class deload. So in our CSS, we will create another selector by typing the deload class followed by the before pseudo element. We'll again use the content property, and this time we'll specify a URL value for the content property, which contains the path to the image we want to use. So we'll go ahead and type the path and the name of the image, pdf.png. I'll then follow it with a little bit of margin to separate the icon from the text. So notice how this time I didn't use any quotes for the content value. Keep in mind that because we're generating an image with this URL function, if we wrapped our value in quotes, it then becomes a literal string, which inserts the actual text written in the quotes as the content instead of the image we need. As we can see here, we see the URL function and the path to the image inserted as content instead of the image itself. So when we remove the quotes around the value and save and refresh, there we see the new image generated before the content. Now, another really neat thing about pseudo elements is that we can use simple functions to return generated content based on an element's attribute. I'll show you what I mean. In the markup, notice the href and title attribute for our download link. The href attribute is examples.pdf, and the title attribute is -pdf. So back in our style sheet, we'll go ahead and add an after pseudo element selector for our deload class. We'll again add the content property, and this time we'll make the content value the attribute function, where we'll insert the link's href value as content. I'll then add a little bit of padding to the left side, and I will make the font size 0.75 em, and I will give it a color value of tomato. So what this does is it takes the value of the attribute we specify, which in this case is the href attribute, and places it as text content next to the element. So we know that the link's href attribute is examples.pdf. So when we save both files, we should see the words examples.pdf generated next to the link. So let's take a look. When we click refresh, there we see the link's href value immediately placed after the link text. And as expected, it reads examples.pdf. If we need to insert the link's title attribute instead, we'll simply need to replace href with title. Now, when we save this and refresh, now the title attribute is inserted after the link's text. As I mentioned earlier, we can leave the content property as an empty string and still be able to insert certain shapes as generated content into the page. So in our HTML file, let's go ahead and add a div element with the class name box to the body of the page. We'll then use this element to generate a pseudo element right before its text. So we'll save our HTML file, and in our style.css file, we'll create a new rule that selects the box class followed by the before pseudo element. We'll add the content property and leave the value as an empty set of quotes. We'll then add a few properties that display it as an inline block element, gives it a width and height, and a background color and border radius. So display, inline block, followed by a width of 30 pixels, a height of 30 pixels. We will give it a background property, the color royal blue, followed by a border radius of 50%, and finally a little bit of margin. So these styles we just added should create the shape of a circle as a pseudo element in our page. So let's take a look. When we save our style sheet and refresh our browser, there we see the circle shape we just created inserted right before the text. And if we add the after pseudo element to the selector, for example, I will type box followed by after, then save our style sheet and refresh, we can see how this also displays it after the text. So as we can see, these are really powerful selectors because we've generated two extra pseudo elements from a single HTML element, and we're able to style them with CSS. And when we view our source code, none of the elements we just added appear in the HTML source, as they were all generated by CSS. So it's only rendered and doesn't become part of the actual DOM tree. But the neat thing is that they're still able to inherit properties from their parent elements. So one of the most important things to keep in mind about pseudo elements is that the generated content is not exactly inserted before and after the actual element, like we might think. It's actually inserted into the element as child content. Let's take a look at how this happens. So back in our style sheet, I'll create a new rule for box where we will add a 1 pixel border around it and give it a little bit of padding, say 10 pixels. Now, everything inside our box element should be contained within the border we set. So let's see how it looks. I'll go ahead and save the style sheet and refresh the browser. Notice how the generated shapes are actually prepended and appended to the inside of the element. So they're inside of its box model. They're inserted before and after the text, not before or after the boundaries of our div element. The good news is these pseudo elements are supported in all modern web browsers. IE7 and below have no support, but fortunately, because they're generally used for decorative content or enhancements, they shouldn't cause any real problems in unsupported browsers.